connecting with the Pennsylvania Game Commission today. My name is Brittany Howell, and my colleague Lori and I will be managing this session. We're fortunate to be joined today by Dan Brauning, the Wildlife Diversity Chief for the Pennsylvania Game Commission. He'll be talking to us about winter birding. We expect this presentation to last about 20 minutes, followed by a question and answer period of about 10 minutes. You can type your questions into the Type Question Here box on the GoToWebinar control panel at the right of your screen. For those of you dialing in to listen by phone, please note that this is not a toll-free call, and you may receive long-distance charges from your service provider. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to our presenter, Dan. Would you like to share a little bit about your background before you get started?
Sure, thanks so much, Brittany. Glad to be here. I'm a lifelong Pennsylvania resident, grew up in Philadelphia, and have been working for the Pennsylvania Game Commission for 27 years. And I've always been interested in birds, and I've been very privileged to be able to have a career in conservation and work with birds in Pennsylvania. The talk today is on winter birding in Pennsylvania, and it's a broad overview of various topics related to that bird life that we enjoy here in the winter months within the Keystone State. And I do want to acknowledge the photographers that I've been using, 2 Game Commission employees, Jake Dingle, who provided the cardinal illustration here, as well as Joe Kosak, who have taken so many wonderful photos of birds that I've employed. And a few other photographers are credited through the talk. So the fact that the seasons change in Pennsylvania is a great reality within the state. And in fact, we really do enjoy, even though maybe the middle of the winter is a hard one, we enjoy the fact that the colors change in the landscapes of our state. And we go from that vibrant summer months to a beautiful fall colors to the gray and white of winter season. The seasons change, and so do the birds. Birds respond to those seasonal changes in various ways. Most dramatically, many species get up and move in response to the different seasons. Millions of birds move annually from winter to summer homes, like these Canada geese that we so much appreciate as they fly across the sky calling out their names. So this migratory movement really drives much of what we know and understand about birds in Pennsylvania. Not only do they physically change their location, but the birds change their appearances. For many species, the seasons bring changes in appearance, like this American goldfinch in its summer plumage, the bright yellow and black coloration that we recognize as a goldfinch changes quite dramatically to the winter scene, where the drab gray and brown and black of a winter goldfinch, it's the same species, in fact the same individual, but it's changing from breeding plumage to wintering plumage. And understanding these changes is part of our ability to identify and recognize the birds around us in winter. So what are the winter birds? More than 60 species of hardy winter birds make their home in Pennsylvania's winter. The poster demonstrated here is available on the Game Commission Outdoor Shop, but it provides a very nice, clean illustration of some of the most common and widespread birds, which are regular across Pennsylvania's winter landscape. I'll be illustrating and talking about just a few of these, certainly not covering every species, but bringing out some highlights of identification and the habitat that are distinctive to the winter birds of the state. So, some of the common winter birds include species which we characterize as permanent residents. I mentioned migration, but not all birds migrate. In fact, those birds which individually spend their whole year in Pennsylvania, we call permanent residents, like this Carolina wren. Carolina wren will sometimes burst out in song in the middle of a cold winter day. That same bird will stay and nest in the same area. Other species that I'll mention include cardinals and chickadees and titmice, and some of the woodpeckers are also permanent residents, like the northern cardinal. Some of those residents begin their nesting season in the middle of the hardest winter days. Great horned owl and bald eagle in particular are year-round residents, and they initiate their annual nesting this time of year in the December or January season. Yes, it's a cold time of year, but these birds have long incubation periods. They sit on their nests for a long time, and the young take a long time to develop. So they have to get their nesting started early. And it's a remarkable process to know that that great horned owl in a woodlot near you is already sitting on eggs. A dramatic illustration of that is a snapshot from the Hanover Eagle Cam, a web camera that's been monitoring the eagle nest in Hanover for a long time. And yes, this is a photo of that winter scene after a heavy snowfall in which the female bald eagle stayed tight on her nest because she had eggs and she had to stay put to keep those eggs warm. We're glad to say that weeks later the snow melted and those eggs hatched. But it's a dramatic illustration of what some of our birds have to go through to survive the winter months. Some other common winter birds include visitors, not permanent residents. In fact, this species, the snow bunting, is only found in Pennsylvania here during the winter months. It's a beautiful, as you can see, white and brown bird that feeds in open agricultural fields, and is certainly one of the species that we pursue and search for, because this is the time of year that we're likely to see it. So snowfall is helpful for us to identify them as the snow bunting and related birds gather around those bare open patches of dirt, scratch for seeds that they find available as food to survive the winters. American tree sparrow is simply another example of a winter visitor. Nesting in Canada, they come into Pennsylvania and are widespread every year. They look very much like a common chipping sparrow, which is a summer resident, but the little yellow at the base of the bill and the lack of a black line through the eye help to distinguish a tree sparrow from a chipping sparrow. This is a common winter visitor. Another high point for birding in the winter months are waterfowl. And water birds from further north do concentrate around open water patches where it's available in Pennsylvania. Now, of course, like many winter visitors, their populations vary greatly from year to year, depending on how cold it is and the availability of habitat, in this case, open water. So this pair of ringnecked ducks, a male and a female, illustrate quite a variety of species that are eagerly sought after during the cold winter months, when if there's an open patch of water, you'll likely find ducks concentrated. And of course, this happens along the Delaware River, on various points on the Susquehanna or Ohio and Allegheny drainages, or on Lake Erie. So it's true across the state. If you find some open water during the coldest, bitterest periods of winter, you'll often find waterfowl such as the ringnecked duck and the hooded mergansers illustrated here. There's many other species involved that we won't illustrate at this time, but it just points to the fact that we do specifically seek out and enjoy the waterfowl as they concentrate around open water. Certainly, food is a critical limiting factor for the survival of winter birds. And it's the most important resource, and it's the reason that many birds do move, get up and go to a different home for the winter. Natural habitats will draw and support wild birds. And to benefit from that, we can plant native species of plants that will help attract birds to your property. So if you want to enhance your birding enjoyment, go and find native plants that you can plant around your property that will provide those food sources in winter. And the Pennsylvania Audubon site, pa.audubon.org, will be able to give you a list of plants that you can provide and identify the species of birds that would be attracted to those. And of course, beyond the native plants, we recognize and enjoy the fact that we can provide food directly to so many wildlife, to so many bird species. Providing food is very popular, and it enables us to connect to wildlife in a unique way. So bird feeding is of great interest and popularity among millions of Pennsylvania residents. It draws species like the chickadee I showed, and blue jay and sparrows, and a variety of other species, and brings them into a close encounter with us that is often otherwise not possible in a wild environment. So whether it be in your backyard that you can look at from your kitchen window, we certainly, many of us enjoy putting up a bird feeder and luring and protecting and providing for those birds. But please understand that this is largely for our benefit. We're feeding birds, and yes, they utilize these foods, but they have natural food sources as well, and they will always have backup plans, as it were, for food, and you're not the only one feeding those birds. But when you do feed, we want to keep it simple, and as a basic starting point, black oil sunflower seeds provide a food source for the most of the species involved. If you want to enhance that with a suet pack, you can draw things like the red-bellied woodpecker shown here, and other insect-eating birds will come to suet. But between these two feed sources, you can provide the needs for the vast majority of the birds that would come to a bird feeder. There are some recommendations we want to make about bird feeding. First of all, it's the placement of the feeder. There is a risk if the feeder is close to glass to your windows, that when birds are startled and fly from the feeder, that they will fly into a window pane. And this causes much mortality in birds. So our recommendation is to place the bird feeder right immediately up against the window pane, actually stuck to the glass, because if a bird flies from it, it hasn't gained enough speed as it leaves the feeder, if it does encounter the window, to cause any injury. But preferably, you want to keep your feeder far away from glass, maybe 10 feet or more, close enough that you can enjoy, but far enough that they'll be less likely to bump into the glass that you're looking through. One of the other reasons to think about the placement of a feeder is to avoid conflicts with other wildlife that's illegal to feed. And this illustration of a bear at a bird feeder is obviously a problem. We don't want to attract, and it's illegal to attract and feed wild bears. So if a bear does encounter your bird feeder, you have to pull in the materials, close it down until the bear is dispersed. Of course, that's mostly a problem in fall and spring. One other important consideration in feeding birds is a recognition that by providing artificial food, we are attracting and concentrating wildlife into a concentrated area, and that does increase the risk that diseases will spread. A disease has cropped up in recent years called conjunctivitis, which is an eye disease that's widespread in finches, as is illustrated by the house finch pictures here. And yes, it's not a pretty scene. House finches, goldfinches, and even pine siskins can contract conjunctivitis. And if you see any sign of this illness in the birds that you're feeding, we recommend that you close the feeder immediately and keep it closed for a week. Clean it thoroughly before reestablishing your bird feeding. We enjoy the birds that are attracted to the feeder, and the last thing we want to do is be the source of spread of the disease. So keep your feeders clean, and particularly be on the lookout for an eye disease. Many other common birds can be found across the Commonwealth. Dark-eyed junco, shown here as this male, is widespread and common, both in woodlands as well as around feeding stations. It's a small bird that's sometimes been called the snowbird because it shows up as snow approaches. But other species won't show up at your feeder, but like the eastern screech owl, are present in Pennsylvania's woodlands, and the winter season can be the best time of year to recognize and hear the whistled call of a screech owl. Going out in the evening hours may give you the opportunity to encounter some of these species. If you'd like to learn more about bird feeding and winter birds, you can also participate in Project Feeder Watch. It's a project organized by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And I mention it because it provides helpful information like this poster, but it also gives you the opportunity to contribute your observations towards the broader understanding of winter birds. There is a fee to participate, and that you use your judgment in that. But Project Feeder Watch is one of a number of structures in which you can engage with others to enjoy winter birds. So a few identification tips. I'll mention this particular suite of finches because this is probably one of the most common identification challenges around a bird feeder. On the left, we see two house finches, a female on the left and a male on the right. House finches are widespread across the state. Originally from the western states, they've moved east and, well, they were introduced in the east and now are widespread and very common. A local native finch, the purple finch, is not nearly as common, and it strictly comes down, primarily comes down in the winter months. But it can be a challenge to distinguish the finch, the purple finch, from the house finch. So you'll notice on the female illustrations, the upper or left-hand picture, in a purple finch, it has distinctive white lines over the eye and streaking in the face, and resulting in a dark patch across the eye. Female house finch will never have that, and that distinctive white and dark pattern in the face identifies a female purple finch. The males of both finches vary quite a bit in terms of the amount of coloration, but you'll notice that a house finch, in the rosy coloration is very red, and in a purple finch on the right, it's a purple or even raspberry color, more uniformly distributed across the body of the male purple finch. These illustrations and experience will let you confidently identify a purple finch if it were to show up at your feeder. Another identification challenge is a bird, the pine siskin, shown here, which is less common than either of those finches, but does occasionally appear in large numbers at our feeders. The pine siskin is a small finch, and you'll notice in comparison with the very similar female house finch that the pine siskin's bill is very pointed and narrow, and that is very different from a house finch. Also note the yellow markings in the wing and tail of a pine siskin, and if a flock of pine siskins appear to your feeder, we hope that this will help you distinguish it from the more common house finch. Another pair of birds are two woodpeckers found year-round in Pennsylvania and widespread. They're superficially very similar. The downy woodpecker is found in almost every woodlot in the state, and the hairy woodpecker is more restricted to larger woodlands, but is still widespread. By markings, they're very similar. The hairy woodpecker is larger in comparison, but more importantly, the bill of a hairy woodpecker is much longer and stocky in comparison to the rest of the head. A little downy woodpecker's bill barely protrudes from the feathers, but a hairy woodpecker's bill sticks out prominently, and that can help you distinguish these two species. There are many highlights to Pennsylvania's winter months. That includes visitors such as the rough-legged hawk, regularly occurring in the open country and farmlands of Pennsylvania. It's another bird that we seek out in the coldest months of the winter because it's the only time of year it'll be seen. This rough-leg is of a light phase. The same species also appears in a dark phase. Both are quite different than the much more widespread and common red-tailed hawk. Rough-legged hawk is a delight to observe. Similarly, a short-eared owl, illustrated on the right, is a rare and local bird, but it forages at dawn and dusk in open grassy fields widely across Pennsylvania, and can be a delight to watch, fluttering across the landscape as it seeks out voles and mice. A horned lark is widespread and it uses the same habitat as the snow bunting mentioned earlier. An open agricultural field, maybe with manure spread or exposed dirt, where the horned larks will seek out the seeds left over from agriculture, is one of those winter treats that we enjoy. But certainly a highlight of the late winter is the annual migration of snow geese and tundra swans. This is a true spectacle of Pennsylvania's late winter experience, concentrated largely at Middle Creek Wildlife Management Area and surrounding agricultural areas of Lancaster County. Tens of thousands and yes, even hundreds of thousands of snow geese concentrate in their northbound migration in late February and March. And as you can gather from the illustration here, it's a true spectacle to see these large concentrations of white and black geese and all white swans gather and move between fields in search of food, but primarily in preparation for a great northbound migration to their breeding grounds in the Arctic. To pursue this is something that every birder wants to experience at some time. It's a true spectacle. Middle Creek Wildlife Management Area is the place, although concentrations of snow geese do appear to the north as they begin their migrations. And certainly a highlight this year, which I would hate to overlook, is the occasional and rather rare infrequent visit of snowy owls from the Arctic. In the winter of 2017 and 18, we saw a movement of snowy owls into Pennsylvania. And as a result, an article had been written up in the Pennsylvania Game News in the January issue. If you want to learn more about this marvelous bird, you can read that article. And that's been commemorated by a Working Together for Wildlife patch and poster, also available at the Outdoor Shop. Snowy owls are here, although it may be difficult to track one down. So we've touched on a variety of birding opportunities and just a little bit of information to whet your interest to get out there and enjoy the winter birds. If you want to learn more, you can participate in the Great Backyard Bird Count, an annual and free activity coordinated by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology on the weekend of February 16th through the 19th, where millions of people across the country will go into a website and add their sightings, contributing to our knowledge. Annually, Christmas bird counts are coordinated by local Audubon chapters and give you an opportunity as well to engage with other birders. And if you simply want to submit your bird checklists to ebird.org, you're encouraged to do that as well. All these are ways in which you can grow in knowledge of birds and contribute your knowledge to the betterment of conservation. So this is just a little invitation to get out and enjoy the winter birds of Pennsylvania. If you want to learn more about that, you can go to the Pennsylvania Game Commission website, click on the Wildlife tab, and then go into Watchable Wildlife to learn more about winter birds in Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for your interest.
Thanks for sharing, Dan. We're going to now open this up to questions, so you can type your questions into the box. The first question that we have came from Karen. She's from Vermont, so she was curious if some of the birds that you were talking about she would also see in Vermont.
Yeah, Karen, I touched on some pretty much common widespread species, and almost everything that was mentioned here would certainly be the case in Vermont as well, and much of the Northeast.
You had also mentioned about keeping bird feeders away from the windows. What are some ways other than just that you can stop birds from hitting the window?
Thanks for your follow-up on that. There are a number of strategies that can be used, including creating film, putting a film over your window that reduces the reflectivity. But the key thing from a bird feeding standpoint is not to have your feeders within that danger zone, which is like a foot to 3 or 4 feet away from the windows. That's the worst place to put the feeder, although it might give you better opportunities to see birds. We don't want birds flying into the glass. Do a Google check for other equipment and resources that will help reduce that risk.
We have another question coming in here. Please recommend a native berry bush to attract cedar waxwings.
Yeah, cedar waxwings are fruit eaters, which is remarkable. Year-round they eat that. So whether it be a small crabapple or a wild cherry especially, that can help attract cedar waxwings to your neighborhood. They're very mobile, and it's a little different than some species. So don't be discouraged if the waxwings don't find your cherry plant in the first year.
Do you happen to have a favorite winter species that you enjoy watching?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I enjoy pine siskins. They do nest in Pennsylvania rarely, but they fly about in small flocks, and they have a petite and just elegance to them that stands out among the other birds, although the cedar waxwings are beautiful to observe as well.
Have you found that the number of finches were down this year? And do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I can't actually speak to population declines this year. Our experience with bird feeding varies so much depending on the available food resources. And we frequently get the question of why aren't, name the species, why aren't they at my feeder? Well, there might simply be a really good natural food supply nearby, so the birds aren't using your feeder as much. It's hard to draw from that local experience, your own experience, into broader patterns. So at this point, we have no concern for any of the finch populations that I've mentioned. The populations are robust even with conjunctivitis.
Do you have any recommendations on how to deter squirrels from the feeders?
It's a grand and ongoing challenge to battle the squirrels. And I thought of showing a couple of the cones that go on the pole that prevents the squirrels from climbing, or maybe dangling that feeder out on a long wire. Squirrels are resourceful, though. Consider it just a challenge as part of your feeding experience.
Is there anything else that you would like to share about Middle Creek? Someone's asking about the tour road. We're checking on that now. I believe the tour road opens on March 1st. Is that the correct date?
I believe that's right. And
you can check that on the website to verify.
Check that on the website, and counts of snow geese are regularly posted there and on other Facebook pages dedicated to birds, so that you can get a better sense of how the migration's going. It does vary from year to year, but you can be sure that there's tens of thousands of snow geese at Middle Creek already this year, and they can be seen from the state highway right through the middle of Middle Creek. So almost any time of year is a great time to visit.
We did verify that on the website. It says that the tour road is closed from September 30th to March 1st. And the Middle Creek Visitor Center is open, though, now in February. A copy of this presentation, a copy of this recording will be sent out to all of you afterwards. That was a question. Is there a way to discourage house sparrows from feeding at backyard feeders?
Probably the best thing to discourage house sparrows, and as a non-native species, that's a good question, is to avoid millets and other feed sources that the sparrows will use. And that's partly why it's not that black oil sunflower will exclude house sparrows, but they're not as capable of using it. And but once they've been attracted to your feeder, they are protected wildlife. So it's just part of the community of birds that have joined around your feeder.
All right, I believe we'll take one more question and then we'll end this up here. Last year, a tufted finch showed up at this person's feeder for a few days, and they were curious if that's common to Pennsylvania or if it was just passing through.
So I'm going to have to make a guess here. There is a species widespread and common, a tufted titmouse, that will regularly come to feeders. I didn't show a picture of it, but it's a regular visitor. And other than that, odd birds will show up at a feeder. Take a picture and send it to the Game Commission, and we'll help identify it.
You can send us those pictures at pgccomments, COMMENTS, @pa.gov. Thank you all for participating, and we hope that you'll join us for our next webinar about grouse coming up at the end of the month.